The flavors of Jhāna. I can't remember where I first heard this term. I think it was from you or
Well,
from
maybe we should
Kenneth.
start with that. Yeah. So the Vince, you came to me and you said, well, I said, no, I said to you, what should we call the retreat? And you're like, well, hey man, you're the one that wanted to do it in Portugal. What should we call it? And kind of put it back to me. And I said, well, can we call it the name of the book of my half-written book? And so this is, folks, this is all coming from a story that's part of the lineage. And I promise we'd tell some of those today. So this is a Kenneth folk story, and it's his way of sort of demonstrating jhana on the spectrum. So Kenneth says this: imagine that you had a glass. Well, imagine a few different scenarios. You've got a bunch of strawberries, and you crush them into a strawberry smoothie, and you just have a pure strawberry smoothie, and you drink that smoothie. What would that taste like? And the answer is, well, that would 100% taste like strawberries, because that's all that's gone into the making of a strawberry. Now, what if you just had a glass of clear water and a pretty strong strawberry extract in a really concentrated form, and you dropped one drop of that into a glass of water? What would that taste like? And then the answer is that would taste like strawberry with just one tiny concentrated drop. And Kenneth's punchline on this is, it all tastes like strawberry, motherfucker. I believe that's the punchline. And his point is, it doesn't really matter where you are on the spectrum of jhana. And we could say, when we say the jhanic spectrum, we're talking about on one end of the spectrum, we have the Pawak tradition, which would have you completely absorbed, so much so that a gun could go off by your head. On the lighter end, we would have Lee Brasington, who teaches jhanic factors, a very sutta-based approach, or maybe some even less rigorous, less absorbed type of jhana. And Kenneth's point is, well, it all tastes like jhana. What are you talking about? It's just a different flavor. And how much of that actual flavor do you need to be able to recognize it? His point is, the tiniest little millionth of a part in a glass in the ocean still would taste like strawberry. So, Vince, let me know if you have a different interpretation on that story. That's how I sort of interacted with that story when Kenneth told me.
Yeah, no, I have a similar interpretation of what he was teaching there, that he was kind of pointing to this sort of depth dimension of jhana and using the sort of strawberry analogy to kind of point out that, like, yeah, these states are kind of patterns of mind. And even if you experience them at a great depth of absorption or focus, it's still the same pattern. You can still recognize that pattern. And that's what we're calling jhana,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of the flavors part. And then maybe we could ask, well, let me raise a question to you then, Vince. So what is jhana? We've got this interesting word with this weird hyphen over the A. So,
Mm. Mm.
and even how I think about it over the years has kind of changed. How do you view what jhana is these days, Vince?
Yeah, for me too, it's changed. And I guess maybe that change is interesting because, like, I imagine this is the case for you as well, Brian. Maybe for everyone who takes up a jhana practice, is at first you experience jhana in the very specific way that you're practicing with it. So you've got whatever tradition you're working in, you've got the meditation object that you've been working with, you've got the instructions, and you've got a bunch of ideas about what is supposed to be happening and what constitutes jhana. And you're using all of that to try to, get into the states that are being described in that practice system. So for me, like when I first started doing jhana practice, it was with Lee Brasington. He was the first jhana teacher I worked with 20 years ago. I went on retreat. Sadly, I left my sick wife at home in the apartment because I didn't want to. This is how self-absorbed I was at the time. I didn't want to get sick at the beginning of a jhana retreat, so I just left her there suffering by herself.
To go off so that you could go
Doing
get
jhana.
concentrated.
Yeah, so
Right.
so that
Yeah.
that should explain the emphasis on wishing all beings concentrated. That's what I needed a little more of. But yeah, for me, it was working within Lee's system. And like you said, the emphasis there is on what's on the breath, but also on the jhanic factors, and started to kind of notice when they get strong enough where you can kind of turn toward those factors and just get absorbed in them, which is like getting absorbed in the strawberry.
Mhm.
So long story short, though, as I expanded to other practices and I was doing more Vipassana, noting style, which I call that Vipassana jhana now.
Mhm.
Um, and I was doing other techniques in more depth. I started to notice, like, well, there's a deep pattern or structure which is the same regardless of the practice I'm doing, which object I'm working with, or even what definitions about the states that should be arising, there's still something that's the same that happens. And for me now, I consider jhana to be just meditation, like the
Mhm.
most, which is a literal translation of the term jhana, which comes
Mhm.
from dhyana, or in this Sanskrit, which is also translated as Zen.
So
And
it goes jhana to Chan Zen in China, and then it makes
Chan,
it over to
yeah,
Chang, jhana, Chang, Zen. And the Zen guys dish jhana all day long, but they're actually, the name of Zen actually means jhana, which is kind of hilarious.
they just don't talk about it because they're being it, I think.
Right, right.
So yeah, that's how I understand jhana now. It's just like, yeah, this is what we're doing is meditation. And whatever you meditate on does change the contours of the state and the experience. And whatever ideals you have certainly changes your relationship to what's arising. Where sometimes a state could be seem totally inadequate, or just it's like a warm up to something deeper. Whereas for other people, that could be the thing that you're aiming for, just like, oh, I'm in it. Now I'm just gonna rest or abide. So I think for me, the world of jhana has opened up and expanded a lot
Mm.
over time.
You said there's some similar quality. Could you say anything more about what that similar quality is?
Yeah, okay. So let's explore that together.
The
This
thing
is
that seems to
it
be
gets a
consistent
little
across.
tricky. Yeah, it gets a little tricky
Mhm.
because I learned it first through the noting maps. And so I'll tend to notice I'll go there to
Yeah.
describe things, even though that doesn't describe the universal quality. But like the stuff you did with the eyes and the eye
Mhm.
posture, like pointing to that, like there's something there where it seems like regardless of which state I'm in, the eyes are moving through this sort of progression that seems to be sort of universal.
Yeah, yeah.
The aperture of attention, like, and kind of how broad or open attention is, and how much it includes the field of experience, that also seems to be like a chief characteristic, regardless of the state or the object I'm working with. What
I
else?
totally concur with you. Yeah, the aperture, I often call it maybe I think Ingram also says the width of the jhana, which is a really weird thing. Like width, how am I going to measure the width? But it's the width of the visual field, essentially. It's what's being pointed to, what's happening in that space when the eyes are closed.
Yeah.
Yeah, what
Yeah.
else is similar there?
I mean, I was going to say something about the body, but the body's something that seems like it changes, like the experience of the body changes a lot depending on where one is in the depth
Hmm.
dimension. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, having experienced those sort of really deep, exclusive states where like the body is described as having dropped off or dissolved.
Yeah, so similar to you. So let's say I've been doing jhana for 15 years, probably Vince a little bit less than you. And we've come to a similar conclusion, I think, which is I think we're just talking about meditation here. And jhana is maybe a placeholder for which sounds like kind of a certain technique, but really it's more than that. And
Mm.
so, like you, Vince, I've come to really feel that jhana just sort of means meditation. And from that perspective, we call our retreat the flavors of jhana, it's the flavors of meditation. And our
Mhm.
meditation community is called the meditation community. Jhana just meaning meditation. I think that's totally appropriate. And so the more that I teach, the more what I come to see is we have 8 discrete jhanic states that are they're pitched in an order of progression. It's linear. So you start with 1 and you go to 8. Kind of makes sense. The practitioner might find something really different though, which is on any given day and any given emotional state, a different state might be more accessible to me. For those of us that wake up in the middle of a lot of suffering and dukkha jnana, we might find that a blissful third jhana is really accessible, maybe for some reasons we can talk about later. So if you start to explore that, then it's like, well, you don't actually have to start at the first to get to the third, do you? You can kind of drop in there some days. There's many practitioners who will tell you how they can just do a cold start right into the fifth jhana. And so if you start following that to its logical conclusion, I think what we start to say is, well, is it possible that whole meditation traditions have been built out around a single jhanic state? And my answer to that is absolutely yes. So Vincent, I think you and I were speaking the other day about what would happen if we said that the best jhanic state was the sixth jhana, and that if we reified that to be the maximum only best thing. Many meditation teachers are only teaching the best thing. So let's be one of those teachers who's only teaching the best thing. What would that look like? And I think you and I agreed, well, that would look a lot like Ramana Maharshi, wouldn't it? That would look a lot like Advaita. I am the world creator and the world destroyer. I am, I am, I am, just pure, infinite, boundless consciousness. And so my current thinking around this is jhana, jhanic states could all be reified so much so that an entire tradition could be built around the fifth jhana or the seventh jhana or the eighth. And in fact, I think they have been built around that. And if you really love the sixth jhana, yeah, go do Advaita. It's probably your perfect cup of tea. I think we'd say that a very similar thing around the fifth or the seventh or the eighth as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you're describing how perhaps entire practice traditions might be centered around specific states as the starting point, and then
I
kind
kind
of
of think
exploring
so.
those
Yeah.
states or the domain around those states. Yeah.
And then so we'll teach eye postures, folks, and I think some of you know, but to talk about that real briefly, it's about the aperture. So a really tight aperture is a first jhanic eye posture, and then it gets a little bit bigger with second, a little bit bigger with third, and then real big with kind of this more expansive fourth jhanic eye posture. So the really interesting question for the formless realm practitioner. Well, in general, I think this makes you become interested in eyes. And then you start to look at other practice. Maybe some of you have a six yogas practice, or you've done Dzogchen, you've done Mahamudra. And if you start to think about that a little bit, where does where do my eyes go, or where do one's eyes go when they do Dzogchen? And you start to play with that a little bit, and you realize there's a very distinct eye posture for Dzogchen. If you look at monks, they'll often practice Dzogchen with their eyes open. Their eyes are kind of flittering all around. They're doing the eye thing. What would that correlate to a state in our jhanic arc? Maybe there's not really a Dzogchen-like jhanic arc. I'm not quite sure around that. But each practice seems to have a discrete eye posture, most of which I think can be sort of correlated to one of the jhanic states. That's a lot how I think about non-jhanic practice these days. What's the closest thing that makes me feel like this in the jhanic practice? And I'm using the eye postures to sort of triangulate around that.
Mm.
As I said all that, it sounded sort of esoteric. Did that sound really esoteric?
Yeah, but for me, I was thinking of something very practical, like in the Dzogchen tradition. When I worked with Lama Lena, her basic instructions are to take like a pebble or rock first,
Yeah.
and as you practice what's called shine, which is like calm abiding, you focus on the rock or the pebble, and then there's another phase of practice in which you just remove the pebble, and then you continue to focus. And so that to me gets at the eye posture of Dzogchen, where previously you had something you were focused on, and then now you're asked to continue focus without that thing. So that's like a very practical instantiation of that, where the eye posture is clearly one that's meant to be open and spacious, but somehow stable and focused as well.
And I love that. So what would that be called? That's samadhi without object.
Yeah,
And in
shamatha without a
Theravada,
sign.
we don't really talk about that, right? In the
Right.
Theravada lineage of which you and I have done probably most of our practice in, Vince, there's no samadhi without a sign. It's always a sign. So that's just so fascinating. That's really deeply aligned with the yogic tradition where they have objectless samadhi. And it's a totally different feeling to do that. And yes, look at something, then take the thing away and keep looking at it. What is that other than an eye posture? My
Mm-hmm.
story on eye posture is from a lineage, like a very deep practitioner I'd love to share with you all. I've shared before, but it's worthwhile to share again. So one of my main teachers is Sayali Susila, who was the chief attendant for Pawak Sayadaw for some couple decades while he was traveling around Asia. So she would spend time with him in Sri Lanka, several years there, cooking his food and being his chief attendant. So very, very close to Pawak Sayadaw, really deeply absorbing his teachings. And one day, so I learned eye postures from Kenneth Folk. And I didn't really need to talk about that with my Pawak teacher because, she was very traditional. I didn't want to bring too much stuff in that might make her feel uncomfortable. But one day I sort of accidentally said, I mentioned that I was using eye postures and I said something about looking towards something. And she said to me in great shock, she goes, "You're looking with your eyes?" Eyes closed, but still looking. She goes, "You're looking with your eyes? Like your actual eyes? Not sort of like some internal drifty." And I said, yeah, I'm looking with my actual eyes. I'm like taking a gaze. And she goes, "Well, if you're doing it already, just keep doing it." I thought she was going to chastise me and say, "Never do that again." But she essentially blessed the practice. So there was something there that was quite profound. I thought, even from the Pawak tradition, they seemed to got a little wink, wink, nod, nod on that one, I think.
Nice. I had a similar experience, although it turned out a little differently with Daniel Ingram. I think I've shared this with you, Brian, where I was wanting to explore the Cassina object, using the circular orb as a visual focus point. And Daniel Ingram had written the Fire Casino book and had been talking a lot about Fire Casino in the years leading up to that. So, but I wasn't really that into the flame. I was kind of wanting to do it like on my computer or whatever. And so his instructions were very much to like take the casino object, close your eyes, and then see the after image, the eidetic image, and focus on that. And that by using that subtle, which I guess in your tradition would be like the nimitta,
Mhm.
you by focusing on that sort of internal nimitta, you eventually get absorbed. Well, you go through a process with that, but eventually it's a kind of a complete absorption in the nimitta. And I understood that, but for some reason I wanted to keep my eyes open doing the practice. It was just like a sort of
Mhm.
intuition or a instinct, and maybe it was like a rebellious thing. I'm going to rebel against what one of my teachers is telling me to do and see if he's right. And I found actually this was so interesting that moving through the third jhana, which he calls the murk, which for me I experienced as the casino breaking apart and
Mhm.
kind of moving around and dissolving and kind of being difficult to focus on, was that eventually my eyes actually settled so much that they were just barely open. It was almost like just a
Mhm.
tiny slit of my eyes were open. And at some point, it shifted into the fourth jhana where all I saw was the color. It was like where I was looking and how my eyes were. And it wasn't like I was trying to engineer this, I was
Right,
actually just
right,
moving
right.
through the state. And I found suddenly that
Mhm.
my eyes were closed at just the right amount and looking at just the right place that all I saw was the color from the casino. And I
Which
was
is
completely
exactly what's supposed to
absorbed.
happen. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the full
exactly.
absorption. How
Yeah,
beautiful and,
with
and so
eyes
organic.
open.
So
Yeah.
amazing.
And I was like, oh, well, my teacher's wrong. Like, you can't just do this, or you don't only have to do this with your eyes closed, taking the internal image. You can work with the external image the entire time through the whole
Yes.
process.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Maybe that's a great transition
Sorry,
into just
Daniel.
talking about no, and we all love Daniel and great respect for everything he's done. And it's nice to have people trying different things out and telling us what actually works.
Yeah.
Maybe we could talk a little about the fact that there are a lot of concentration objects and what we will be offering in the retreat as far as what people might like to do around that.
Yeah,
Pretty
that's
cool.
cool.
So folks, actually, I don't have my list on me, and I wouldn't be able to remember this because it's just too many. But there's traditionally 40 concentration objects, and the breath is one of those. The Brahma Viharas, like loving kindness, would be included. Things like contemplating the foulness of the body, contemplating pus, or contemplating urine or feces would be considered part of that as well. And then you have all the kasina, which are really traditional, and also sort of contemplating the dharmas would be a concentration object as well. And so there's this premise that there's only 40, but like every single sutta or everything in Buddhism, there's always a sutta that says the opposite. And so what it turns out, there's a beautiful story where the Buddha meets a person, and the Buddha had the ability to see into people's past lives. And when he met this person, he could see this person had been a jeweler in a previous life. And so when the person came to him to request his object of concentration, which is how it's done in the old days, you go to your teacher and they give you the most suitable object, which is how it happened for me too in Malaysia. She will tell me what to do. I don't get to pick. She's going to pick based on her supreme knowledge, right? And the Buddha to this jeweler, he says, clearly you were a jeweler in a previous life. I'm going to have you concentrate on this big, beautiful red ruby, because he knew this style was just going to be fully, really love the jewel, the ruby. So apparently we could say the ruby is the 41st concentration object. But what I think we can actually take away from that story is you can choose anything as a concentration object. Vince says, maybe you want to talk about later your story about Vince took the number one as a concentration object on a full retreat, which is like, whoa, where would that go? What's the sign of the number one, the nimitta? That's really fascinating. So there's all these different concentration objects. The breath is a wonderful object. I really promote the breath simply because I always have it with me. I don't need to take a bench with me. I don't have to have a cushion. I don't have to have a fancy colored thing. I don't have to have my computer. I can do it anywhere I am. It's always with me, the breath. And the breath produces this nimitta, this visual sign that allows us to get fully absorbed as well. Some of the other concentration objects wouldn't take one to that level of nimitta. And so for our retreat, it's going to be happening January 2nd. Vince and I's idea is we're very non-dogmatic teachers and we really like a spirit of openness and exploration. And we're going to invite all the participants to choose their object of concentration. I think probably Vince, both of us will be teaching from one object. I'll be teaching from the breath for sure, because that's my preferred object. But you're welcome to choose a casina. You could choose flame if you want. I think we can find a way to have you do a fire casino somewhere if you wanted, et cetera, water, whatever you might like to work with. Vince, anything you want to add to that? Just kind of how we're hoping to really keep it open for people on the retreat.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting experiment because most concentration retreats, and I think both of our experience, the whole group is being taught one object. and is usually, though not always, doing one object focus together. And here, the idea is, well, yeah, we're all going to be focusing on one thing, but that one thing could be different depending on who you are and what you're resonating with and where you want to go deep with during that retreat. So it's a kind of interesting balance of kind of the diversity of possible objects that one could be working with and the universal experience of deepening with your meditation object. So we're going to be focusing on kind of like the universal patterns here, and the universal challenges that arise when trying to focus on anything, whether it be a jewel or a number or the breath. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful that we can weave those two worlds together. And my hope is that the deepening that happens often on retreat that can be felt, the extra support, that we don't lose that just because there's a diversity of objects being worked with, but rather that it creates something like a more like complex field of concentration. Like the complexity
Mm.
of a wine when you drink.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
more.
Complex
It's
harmonics.
Yeah, exactly. There's a complexity there because of the way that
Mm.
difference is coming together. And I guess I felt that in the jhana community, with your shamatha jhana and the vipassana
Mm.
jhana and the metta jhana. Like there is something I've seen with people that are going to multiple of these groups where, they're getting like more of the flavor of the practice and what it could
Mm.
be like, by dipping into these different subjects.
That's fascinating. And that metaphor of complex wine is really lovely. And complex harmonics tend to make interesting music. So that's great. Should we talk about the breadth and the depth? So something that you and I
Yeah.
often, so for those who are listening to this, Vince and I will often come across, so Vince and I are fairly non-dogmatic in the sense that we're really open to all doorways. And certain teachers that have been, brought up in strong traditions, they have a really strong idea about what jhana is and what it isn't, which I completely respect. And I really want to honor those classical traditions as well. I love that stuff. And I'm completely drawn towards that as well. But Vincent, I think I know we have a bit of a different approach. What should we say about the breadth, maybe in the depth that we're hoping to cover, Vince?
Yeah, well, I mean, personally, I can say I've struggled with this a lot over the years of practice.
Totally.
Having come up as a lay person, I decided not to go the monastic route because of my girlfriend, now wife. I didn't want to lose that relationship. I felt important. So I was always doing the thing. And I think you had the same experience for a while. We're kind of going in and out of retreat,
Totally.
uh, and going in and out of daily practice, doing an hour or two a day, formal practice, going in and out of a month or so on retreat, coming back. And I experienced the oscillation between daily life and retreat life to be very fruitful on the one hand, where it felt like I kept kind of plunging the depths and then coming back, but then also very challenging and confusing on the other end of like, how do I bridge these two realities together? It almost could feel schizophrenic at times coming in and out of that space. And part of what I learned really working with Kenneth's social noting exercises initially and teaching was, oh, like I need to be able to connect these states across my relationships. Now that I need to be able to be present in relationship, not just by myself in silence on retreat. I need to find a way to bring this to bear, like on everything, and also be more okay not being in really concentrated states, since
Yeah.
there's times where it's just going to be hard to do that. I know we've talked about your experience. I've laughed a number of times thinking about your experience going from like super hardcore Pa'ak style retreat practice to being like in Tokyo with your wife, trying to maintain some of that depth while in like an environment that just doesn't seem designed to do that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your experience
Yeah.
trying to
So
maintain the depth.
just a general comment. This is less about Vince and I being meditation teachers and just trying to be skillful human beings in the world. If your partner's getting mad at you because of how you meditate, you're probably not doing it right. There's something going on that's probably out of sync. And so what that looked like for me was, well, I'm going to be clearly I needed to be the best jhana master ever to live, who was a Westerner, I think. Second only to Falk or something like that. And what did that mean practically? It meant trying to live a life where I'm meditating 4 to 5 hours a day while maintaining a full-time job and a marriage. And, that's sustainable for a certain amount of time. But what it actually means you need to do is you need to be dropping into the Anapana spot when your wife goes to the bathroom at dinner. And if you're thinking about that, you're probably actually thinking about it while you're eating dinner. And you might even take a moment to touch it while you're eating dinner. And then the wife will actually notice and she'll say, stop meditating. Because she's sensitive to all your moods because she's been living with you. She knows when you're meditating, even if you think you're hiding it. And so this is actually failure mode. I don't think this is a good move. And so it's exactly what Vince is saying. You know, we come to, so there's something super beautiful about learning to get fully absorbed in a jhanic experience, which tends to take some time for most people. There's sort of a time on the cushion element to that, just because of the sort of relative time it takes to build up the concentrated facility. But we also have lives to live, and there's certain things going on that make it sort of impractical some of the time. So what's the happy medium? I think is what's actually practical for us as
Mm,
lay people. Now,
mm,
one of my dear teachers is Tina Rasmussen. She's my first jhana teacher, and therefore I feel a really, really strong connection to Tina, who was one of my first Palo teachers. But Tina won't think that what Vince and I are teaching is jhana, because and, you know, some of the things that were being taught in the jhana community, she wouldn't call jhana because it's a little bit too far out of the rails of the Palo tradition. And I totally understand that. And I respect that. And maybe Lee would have his own opinions on that. And all these teachers have all these opinions. I think what Vince and I would like to offer you all is we're going to hold all of that. We're big enough to hold all of that, accept all of that, agree kind of with all of that, and be open to disagreeing with all of that. But we're going to say that's all going to fit somewhere on the spectrum. We're happy. And in fact, I think within the community, we hope we have teachers who could orient you to any part of the spectrum, because at certain times of your life, some parts will be more interesting than others. If you're on a month long at the forest refuge, go for full absorption with a nimitta. Why not? What a beautiful thing to have done in your life. If you're living a layperson's life and you meditate for about 20 minutes in the morning, maybe just get a little bit of nice piti going per Lee Brasington's instructions, because that's totally accessible in 15 minutes. What's going to make you feel good? Jhana ultimately is really being offered as an episodic intervention to suffering. That's how the Buddha taught it. It's how he practiced it. You can read that in the suttas. You know, he entered jhana at the end of his life because he was sick. This is exactly how it was taught and how we still can do it today.
mm. Brian, you mentioned the spectrum, and I know we've talked explicitly about the depth dimension as a spectrum. And here I'm kind of like visually imagining this as like a vertical spectrum, you know, where as you go down, you get deeper. But I've also been thinking in the jhana community about like another axis, which is the breadth axis. So if I were to map these together, like depth going vertically and breadth going horizontally, that would give like a bit more like a grid. And I think the breadth dimension, we were kind of talking about this here, and it's good to make it explicit, which is like you
Yeah.
can, you know, and the way I understand the Pa'ak tradition really is that it's focused on a very exclusive kind of breadth, very hyper focused on the object and super deep. So it'd be like in the lower left quadrant of this is like super
Yeah.
exclusive and super
Yeah.
deep.
Yeah.
And what I've been realizing I've been trying to do in the last decade or so is kind of live on the other side of the
Yeah.
spectrum,
Yeah.
which is the more inclusive dimension of jhana, which I find you can actually take very deep. And maybe the Zen tradition is the best place where that's sort of emphasized, where it's like your practice and your life are all kind of integrated in one. And there's really an emphasis not on preferencing like being in a particular posture or being doing a particular thing. It's just like your whole life is the meditation. And you know, that to me is like, okay, that's a more inclusive kind of meditation experience or jhanic experience where everything that arises is part of the practice, you know. And
Mm,
I like thinking of like the, you know, Karate Kid, you know, it's like, are they the beginning of the Karate Kid, you know, it's like, what are they learning? Wax on, wax off. You're learning
mm,
like every basic movement can be kung fu, you know. And so
mm.
like if you turn everything you do into the meditation, then you can have a kind of inclusive attention or awareness that doesn't get knocked off by the changingness of the content of experience.
Say
um
more about inclusive, exclusive, and I think you were doing one or the other when you did our guided sit today. We were talking a lot about make concentration arise for all. We even doing a little bit of a visualization of what would the world look like should we all be so concentrated. Which can you point to what you were doing there, whether that was inclusive or exclusive, and how you see those
yeah,
two?
that's a good example,
Mm,
Brian. That was a move toward more inclusiveness, including the imaginal capacity, which you'd already brought online really with the rails, feeling in the breath. So it's just kind of working off of that, but also including in awareness more of a sense of others. And I think what I learned from Ken Wilber, the integral philosopher, is like we really can include these kind of core perspectives. We can include our first person experience, which to me that's already included even in the most exclusive deep jhana states. You're including your own experience. You have to, because that's where it's happening. But then you can also include others' experience. You sort of open to and include in your awareness other people. And the early Buddhist tradition has good examples of that, like in the Satipatthana Sutta, as they're describing the kind of mindfulness you want to establish. It said, establish this mindfulness internally and externally. And so there's already there some clear instructions for how you can have a more inclusive kind of focus that includes not just your own experience, but also others. And then the third thing you could include from an integral perspective is the third person perspective, which is like the external world, nature, the world of nature. And lately I've been sitting for 24 minutes a day outside on my back porch. That's been my practice,
Uh-huh.
just sitting. And it's a very inclusive practice because the eyes are open, ears are open, body's open, and you're just sitting and being with whatever is. In my case, it's with Emily and with like the sounds of what's happening in the
Mhm.
neighborhood.
What a
And
beautiful practice.
that
Mhm.
to me is like more inclusive, is if like you open from your first person to include others and then include the
Mhm.
world. If you include all those things, you're sitting in a very inclusive way, or walking or standing or whatever posture you might be in.
And folks, that what's the proximate cause for concentration? Well, that's concentration. We've all heard that before. It's a kind of a funny joke. I think we talk about like Shakti and passing our concentration to others, which I hear a lot. People say when they're with me, they feel more concentrated. I think that's because I'm including them. I'm trying to include them in that space. I want them to be part of that. And I'm sort of inviting them into mine, and they're giving me some back, and we're all kind of building it together. The A little bit more on the spectrum. So my natural resting place on the spectrum and Vince's natural resting place on the spectrum are actually at totally opposite ends of the spectrum. I want you guys to know that, because I think that's really great that you have a teacher who sits on each side, and therefore we can cover all the middle. So I'm 100% exclusive, and that's how I was taught to practice. And so one of the primary things I do when I'm correcting students who come to me to learn power of jhana is people have been highly influenced by, well, Vince, or they've been highly influenced by the mind illuminated Shuladasa, and they'll come in, and then I'll learn like on session 4, like I hadn't realized it because they haven't told me yet. Like, oh yeah, I'm always leaving 10% of my awareness in the room to, like, note things before they arise, and I'm like, no, 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 no. You don't leave any awareness in the room. You put 100% here. We're never doing anything but that. And that turns out to be revelatory. People are like, oh, I don't leave any in the room. And I'm like, no, this is an exclusive practice, 100%. And some of us will really be drawn to that. You guys can feel the renunciate vibe of that. Theravada, it tends to be sort of a renunciate practice. That turning is sort of renunciate practice. And those of us who are incredibly drawn to absorption tend to have a little bit of that renunciate vibe. I absolutely have that in myself. Vince on the other side has taken, all great teachers will have students who will take something they've taught and run with it and reify it and make it great. And Vince took social meditation from Kenneth, and I took eye postures. Kenneth
Mhm.
talked about eye postures a little bit, but I went and made it the whole thing. Kenneth is even surprised by how big it's got at this point. And I think you'd say the same about Vince in social meditation. So just a little bit there about how our natural resting places, I think, make us really great teaching partners, in the sense that we love to cover the whole end of all the spectrum from our respective ends, which are the exact opposite ends. I think, Vince, that we sit to the opposite ends on that naturally.
Yeah, but we can meet in the middle, which is I think
Yes.
important. It's we both have that experience of being on the other side. So yeah, to your point, I mean, that's we'll do some social meditation on this retreat as well, regularly, and the intention there is to kind of play with extending attention to include more. I was thinking about, what is the core difference between the sort of the exclusive and inclusive ends of that spectrum, and it's more or less reduces down to whether you're saying no to experience outside of the object you're working with, or whether you're saying yes,
Yeah.
or whether the
Great.
object you're working with
Perfect.
includes those everything else. And it
Mm.
in that sense, like I would say, all practice is working with that spectrum, because there are times, even probably in the POC tradition, I imagine, where something could be arising that actually keeps you from being able to 100% focus on here. And you actually at some point have to maybe turn toward it and deal with it or address it so that you can come back to 100% focus here. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so the most radical power teacher will say, "You don't even do that," and they're not
Okay.
gonna even acknowledge that there's a hindrance taking you away because that would be that would almost be like an admission of defeat.
Like
And
you
so
feeding
it's
it or
just like
something?
yeah, like feeding or something. So it's just focus here. That being said, there's a whole in the more modern power teachers, they talk a lot about transformation versus transcendence. And the frame on this is with jhana, we're aiming for transcendence. We are going to intensely ecstatic states that one would never experience without doing the practice. And these are supranormal human states, way beyond the pale of normal human experience. But sometimes that doesn't work because we're super hungry or we hate our boss and we're being pulled away by hindrances, we could say.
Mhm.
And then when that happens, we simply can't concentrate. Focus here is not an option. And the more modern teachers are a little bit more flexible around that. And they say, that's when we shift from transcendence into transformation.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is personality transformation. And they will propose that you do some work around working with the hindrances so that you can free up that energy to go back to the Anapana spot. Any hindrance is just taking something away from energy that could be put always right here, focus here, always and forever, even when you don't feel like it, is sort of the message of that tradition.
Mm. So this is cool. I think that I'm thinking the way this will probably play out on this retreat is like we'll be offering different perspectives from either side of that, and the
Yes.
exploration is going to be around figuring out how to work with that kind of more inclusive versus less like more exclusive focus, and finding the sweet spot, for you in that on that spectrum.
I think that's what we're offering. I've never, folks, I've never done a jhana retreat that wasn't full noble silence. So it's actually quite novel for me to go into a very strong concentration practice, but also have the space to be more inclusive. And that's what I want to do this time. I think that's a great approach. I think it'll bear great fruit for us.